Well, this is the end of January 2022, and I'm about to upload over the course of the next few days, probably, the last two clips from the so-called Sagathakam, which is the ending verse section of the Lankavatara Sutra. And this completes my commitment to the project of actually reciting in essentially unabridged form the entire D.T. Suzuki translation of the Lankavatara, which again includes this last major section of verses, which frankly, I don't know that there's another English translation, because Red Pine, when he translated the Lankavatara, elected to not translate those particular verses. And as you hear more about a description of the verses, you may get a little more of a sense of why that might have been. Because they are kind of a mixed bag of very meaningful, profound kinds of verses, as well as ones that are difficult to fathom in terms of what the meaning is, or the Buddhist kind of connotation associated with their meaning. So what I wanted to do in this little video, in celebration, if you will, of completing this project, is to share a little bit from Suzuki on the Sagathakam verses. And this comes from his studies in the Lankavatara Sutra, which is a separate volume from his actual translation of the Lankavatara. And I would strongly recommend obtaining a copy of it for anybody that's interested in getting a more in-depth sense of what the meaning is of this amazing sutra, which, frankly, as I understand it, was the key sutra or scripture studied within Chan Buddhism in China prior to the sixth patriarch, Huineng, when at that point in time there was a transition, I think, to more of a focus on the Diamond Sutra. Now, I've already recited several elements of Suzuki's studies, and those are available. All of it is available on a playlist called Lankavatara Sutra. And so, if you want to either hear the recitation of the sutra itself or listen to some of the comments by Suzuki in his studies book, they're available there. And with regard to the Sagathakam, again, I would say, actually, in my recitation, I include all of them, 884 verses. Now, the thing of it is that not all of those verses are actually listed one by one in the translation. In other words, there's several areas within the verse section of the Lanka where references made to various verses within chapters of the Lankavatara. So to recite them in order, I kind of had to go back at different points and actually dig through the chapter where the verses were referenced, if that makes any sense. And so, while I'm not touting my particular presentation, I would say in some ways it's easier, if you're interested in this verse section, to listen to my recitation than it is to actually pour through the book, because then you have to go back to the various chapters in order to get different sections that are referenced only by chapter number and verse number within the latter portion of the total verse section within the Lanka. That probably doesn't make any sense, but if you dig into this, you'll see what I mean. The other thing is, I have to say, I'm sure that my pronunciation on some of the words, the Sanskrit words and names within the Sagathakam, or even the name Sagathakam, that may not be a proper pronunciation, and I plead guilty in that regard. But again, this is an amazing section that presents a bit of a puzzle in terms of why it's there and what it is. And I thought Suzuki's explanation that he provided in his introduction to his book on the studies in the Lankavatara, that within that introduction he addresses it. And one of the key things he says is that it's, quote, nothing but a heap of rubbish and gems. And I agree with that. There are, again, some verses that are hard to make sense of, and others that are just amazingly profound. And what I did early on, and I had the good fortune, when I first got into Buddhism, really amazingly good fortune, because at that time, back in 1979, 1980, I mean, there just weren't very many books at all in English on any of the sutras, any of the scriptures. And at a bookstore in Asheville, I actually found the Lankavatara Sutra, this hardback, brown-covered version, and the studies, which is a separate book. Now, this particular book, which I don't have the studies in front of me, but it was first published in 1932, which tells you when Suzuki was digging into this amazing scripture. And then this particular version, or the book I have in my hand, was reprinted in 1956, 59, 66, 68, and 73. So, and it was printed in Great Britain, and it was printed by Routledge and Kagan Paul in London. So, the fact that it was available to me in 1979, having come out in this reprinted edition in 1973, and the fact that I was able to find it in rural Western North Carolina was a gift from the heavens, if you will. So anyway, that's enough preamble, and I may stop along the way and throw in a comment or two of my own. And some of this may or may not make sense. You have to kind of really immerse yourself in this, but I will recite Suzuki's commentary on the Sagathakam in his introduction to the book Studies in Lankavatara Sutra, which I think now is available in paperback and also available in online PDF form if you're not inclined to purchase the book. He says, now we come to consider the last chapter, which is the last chapter of the Lankavatara Sutra, entitled in the Sanskrit edition Sagathakam, Sagathakam. I call it Sagathakam, which occupies a special position in the structure of the Lankavatara. As the title indicates, it is composed entirely of gathas, gathas being verses. In the Sanskrit, there are 884 couplets, taking up about 1/4 of the whole text. So this was an amazing amount of material. And I have to acknowledge and admit, when I do my various recitations and uploads, I mean, there are some things that I very much enjoy reciting and reflecting upon, perhaps more so than others, but I feel a commitment from an ecumenical point of view and from the point of view of expedient means to be able to share different kinds of teachings, because I know different people listening to my channel will appreciate different teachings. I know that for a fact. And so, again, with respect to the Sagathakam, I probably already have said this, so I'm kind of repeating myself perhaps, but there are some when I went through it the first time that I underlined that are amazing, and others that I'm like, what? But anyway, in the Sanskrit, there are 884 couplets taking up about 1/4 of the whole text. Of these, over 200 are found in the main text itself. So again, what I was talking about earlier, where you have to refer back to the main text, to a particular chapter and the verse numbers within that chapter in order to glean where they, quote, fit within the flow of the Sagathakam itself. So again, of the 884, over 200 are found in the main text. Therefore, about 680 gathas are newly added ones. In Sikshananda, these repetitions are systematically excluded from its gatha chapter, while in Bodhiruchi, everything is thrown in and with something more. There are 890 quatrains in Bodhiruchi and 656 in Sikshananda, showing the relative amount of stanzas in each, as 4 Chinese lines are generally equivalent to 1 Sanskrit stanza. Now, I don't have knowledge of those differentiations, and I'm not going to try to speculate in terms of what those differences are, but anybody that's really wanting to get into the weeds, I'm sure can study that. But I want to go on and say, as he is saying now, as for the contents and their arrangement, there is utter chaos in the Sagathakam. So he says, no doubt they chiefly concern the same themes as treated in the main text, but there are some original theses, and it is often hard to see why and how they came to be thrown in there. To read the Sagathakam properly, therefore, it must be cut up into so many small portions, sometimes taking just one solitary sloka as expressing a complete idea, that is, as a sort of aphorism. And I'm not sure the definition of sloka, let's take it to mean a line or a verse. So again, he's saying that, to read it properly, you kind of have to cut it up, sometimes just taking one line or one verse as expressing a complete idea. And that's true. That's the way it is. When this cutting up process is brought to an end, we see that the Sagathakam, which appears on the surface as one solid chain of gathas, is nothing but a heap of rubbish and gems. What an apt and accurate description of it. But it's worth looking through it to get the gems. And maybe at the end of this video, that would be a good thing to do. I will maybe go back and recite some of the ones that I underlined that I think are really amazing. So he says, how did this conglomeration come to be affixed to the Lankavatara? Why do we find so many gathas taken from the sutra proper and mixed up with the rest? And the way they are mixed is most strange, seeing that while some are taken in bodily just as they are found in the sutra itself, others are broken up and interspersed fantastically among the rest. Was this done intentionally, or did it happen just so? Does the Sagathakam suggest an earlier origin than the sutra, in which the gatha part was later elaborated in the prose in the way of commentary? Well, that's an interesting theory. I think in some of the other sutras, and I'm thinking about the Lotus Sutra in particular, which is, of course, one of my very, very favorites. As I'm recalling, I think there was some thinking to the effect that the verse section was the first that was actually written down, and that the prose sections were added as more or less elaborations of the verses. So he's saying maybe that was the case here. He goes on to say, but there is some reason to suppose that the Sagathakam as a whole and in detail is later than the sutra proper, partly because it contains some historical matter which has no place in it, but chiefly because the thought expressed here seems to be more definite and developed than that in the body of the sutra. Taking all in all, the relation between the Sagathakam and the rest of the sutra is a mystery, because we have as yet reached no sure ground in the historical study of Mahayana literature in India. Now again, Suzuki wrote this in the early 1930s, and I don't know. I suspect there's been more scholarship and study since then, and I just don't have access to it. And if anybody has some links or particularly things in English that could help us English-speaking folk, get a better handle on how we should view this first section, I'd be grateful for that. I personally haven't done that study or research. He said, this much we may say, that the Sagathakam can easily be made into an independent text expounding the principal truths of the Mahayana philosophy. It reminds one of a notebook in which a student of the Mahayana took down some of the more important ideas as he learned them orally from his master, and in which, at the same time, he also put some other matter for his own benefit, though not necessarily in close relationship with the main context of the notebook. Interesting theory. In this respect, the Sagathakam shares the characteristics of the sutra as a whole. It may be noticed that the Sikshananda calls this part of the text the chapter of Gathas, and Bodhiruchi simply calls it general chapter, while the Sanskrit edition is prefaced, listen to the jewel-made Gathas preached in the Lankavatara Sutra and free from the net of the erroneous views and containing the wonderful Mahayana teaching, and concludes with this. Now I want to go back and give that title again. That the Sanskrit edition prefaces the Sagathakam section with this statement, quote, listen to the jewel-made Gathas preached in the Lankavatara Sutra, and free from the net of the erroneous views, and containing the wonderful Mahayana teaching. Close quote. That's pretty cool. And the Sanskrit edition, his preface concludes with this, and then he gives a line of Sanskrit, which is unintelligible to me, but he then tries to render it in English when he says, this may be rendered into English, quote, thus is completed the Mahayana Sutra, the noble orthodox Dharma called Lankavatara, together with the Gathas, close quote. According to the postscript thus translated, the Gatha section does not seem to have any special title for itself. For if Sagathakam means, quote, that which is together with the Gatha, close quote, the designation must be regarded as applying to the whole Sutra of Lankavatara, and not to this last section exclusively, made up with Gathas. What helps this interpretation is the Tibetan postscript, which reads, quote, and again he gives actually the Tibetan language, but then he says, this generally coincides with the Sanskrit, except the one most important phrase, and he gives the Tibetan, which may be Sanskritized, yatha labdam. This means, quote, as far as obtainable, or as is available, which in the present case points to the possible existence of more Gathas, or text belonging to the Lankavatara proper, showing at the same time the incompleteness of the sutra as we have it now. Yatha labdam is also found at the end of the Arya Manjushri Mulakalpa, or Trivandrum Sanskrit Series 84, 1925, Trivandrum, which is one of the sutras having no usual sutra ending, and also at the end of the Ganda Vyuha, which to all appearance is a complete sutra. Incidentally, reference may be made to certain lines in the Sagathakam, which are often quoted by followers of Shin Buddhism as teaching Amitabha's land of bliss and also predicting the rise of Nagarjuna. So here we have something related to Shin Buddhism. And again, going back, I'm not sure when we said, let's see, the Sanskrit edition is prefaced. So that wasn't a phrase that was prefacing the Gatha section. It was a phrase that was prefacing the entire Lankavatara in the Sanskrit version. When we said, listen to the jewel-made Gathas preached in the Lankavatara Sutra and free from the net of the erroneous views and containing the wonderful Mahayana teaching. I think that's perhaps more accurate there. But again, get your own copy of the studies book and take a closer look at this in a more comprehensive way than what I'm able to throw out at you in this little video. In other words, I'm just trying to give you a broad overview and what's the term? Wet your tongue. In other words, to give you a little taste and encourage you to dig deeper. Anyhow, yeah, there were some lines, some Gathas related to Amitabha, and so here he says these are the lines, quote, the matured or Vaipakika Buddhas and manifested or Nirmanika Buddhas and beings and bodhisattvas in their lands, they are in the 10 quarters. Now, my understanding is that in the Lankavatara, there wasn't the full-fledged Trikaya doctrine yet with the 3 bodies of the Buddha. But this line obviously talks about different kinds of Buddhas having their own lands. And in the full-fledged, fleshed-out Mahayana doctrine, I believe all the cosmic or spiritual level Buddhas had their own Buddha lands, and it's just that Amida, he had the best and the one that all the other Buddhas praised, and they praised his vows, which made it easy for people who didn't have the capability of self-power practices to be able to enter a Buddha land and to be able to attain Buddhahood more easily. Anyhow, this next verse that he quotes, he says, the flowing or Nisyanda Buddhas, and the reality or Dharma Buddhas, the transformed or Nirmana Buddhas, and the manifested ones or Nirmanika, they all issue from Amitabha's land of happiness. Wow. This, I didn't recall this particular verse when I started doing this video, and I'm kind of reading this cold, which I probably shouldn't do, but so be it. But this is totally consistent with my view of Amitabha Buddha. And again, different schools of Buddhism view different Buddhas as being supreme, if you will, or ultimate. And of course, within Pure Land Buddhism, Shin Buddhism in particular, we view Amida Buddha as the ultimate Buddha, in the sense that all other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are emanations of Amida Buddha. And so this totally fits with that kind of concept. Now, whether it was added later because of folks who wanted to influence the direction of the Dharma or the teaching within the Lankavatara toward more of a Pure Land belief system, I don't know. But I love that particular verse, and we could really modify it a little bit in terms of the three body theory to say, all of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the Sambhogakaya and those at the level of the Nirmanakaya are emanations from Amitabha Buddha. So there you have it. Now, as far as the Dharmakaya, Amida is an emanation of the Dharmakaya in my view. Shinran talks about Dharma body. He talks Dharma body as compassion, which again would be like Amida Buddha as a manifestation of the Dharmakaya, but with the essence being compassion and a desire to save all beings, which he does through his profound vows. Further, he quotes another verse, quote, "My vehicle of self-realization is beyond the attainment of the philosophers. Asked Mahamate, pray tell me, after the teacher passes, who would keep this up? After the time when the Sugata is passed away and no more, O Mahamate, know that there will be one who can hold up the eye of the Dharma." So a lot of the Lankavatara is a dialogue between the Buddha and Mahamate. And so here we have it. And Sugata is another word for Buddha. Now, Suzuki goes on to quote a couple of more verses here. "In the southern part of this country called Vedali, there will be a bhikshu of great and excellent reputation known as Nagavaya, who will destroy the one-sided view of being and non-being. He will, while in the world, make manifest the unsurpassable Mahayana, and attaining the stage of joy, pass to the land of happiness." So that's where Suzuki is saying that the verses talk about talk about Nagarjuna, the great philosopher Buddhist who, frankly, is viewed as the first patriarch of some of the important Buddhist sects, such as Shin Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. And so it's interesting here that, again, that's what he did, in effect, was to destroy the one-sided view of being and non-being through his philosophy of negation of anything that we can think of as a concept as being fundamentally true, that it's neither this nor that, it's neither this nor that, and goes on ad infinitum with that kind of philosophical argument. And it's interesting, too, though, here, that he attains the stage of joy. That's typically considered to be like the first stage of the Bodhisattva path. But then he passes to the land of happiness, which is another reference to Amida's Pure Land. So Suzuki finally winds up this section of his introduction by saying, in the Sanskrit text we have, instead of Nagarjuna, Nagavaya, and of course we do not know whether they are one person or whether there is a mistake on the part of the scribe. From these passages alone, it is difficult to infer anything historical concerning the age of the Lankavatara as a whole, and also its possible relation to the doctrine of Amitabha's land of bliss, or Sukhavati. So I'll complete this reference here to Suzuki's comments by giving his summary then of the chapters of the Lankavatara, where he says, in short, The Lankavatara Sutra may be divided as regards its textual construction into the following 6 specifically definable parts. The Ravana chapter, the section devoted to the enumeration of the so-called 108 questions and 108 terms, the prose section in which no verses are found, the prose and verse section which may be subdivided into A, the part devoted to a discourse carried on principally in verse, for instance, paragraphs on the system of Vijnanas, B, the part containing ideas fully developed both in prose and verse, for example, meat-eating chapter, C, the part containing ideas fully discussed in prose and supposedly recapitulated in verse, as in the greater parts of the text. And then the 5th section being the Dharani section, which are these Sanskrit words that are supposed to have some kind of magical quality. And then 6th, the last section being the Sagathakam. So there you have some comments on this last section. And I commend anybody who, frankly, can either slog through it in book form or through means of my recitation. But when we go to it, let me just recite a few verses that had great meaning for me early on and that continue to have great meaning for me. Verse 17. When a turning back takes place in the mind, one abides permanently in the palace of lotus form, which is born of the realm of Maya. Abiding in it, one attains a life of imagelessness, and, like a many-colored jewel, performs religious deeds for all beings. That's verses 17 and 18, and refers, I believe, to the eighth stage on the Bodhisattva path. Verse 32. When the truth-seeker sees the truth devoid of discrimination and free from impurities, then he is accomplished in his contemplation. He sees me, there is no doubt. And then in verse 35, we have this theme about reality being like a dream that we hear over and over in some of the sutras, where it says, the world is the same as a dream, and so are the multiplicities of things in it. The wise see property, touch, death, a world teacher, and work as of the same nature. In other words, as a dream. Here we go with something similar in verse 44. The world is no more than a thought construction, and there rages an ocean of views as regards ego and things, or dharma. When the world is clearly perceived as such, and there takes place a revulsion in the mind, this one is my child, who is devoted to the truth of perfect knowledge. Again, I love this reference to a revulsion in the mind, representing that kind of religious conversion experience, as I would understand it, similar to what is articulated in the book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Here we go in verse 77. The triple world of existence is no more than thought construction, which is discriminated by the twofold svabhavha of imagination and relative knowledge. But when, within the mind, a turning away from the course of sense objects, or dharma, and the ego soul, or pudgala, takes place, then we have the truth of suchness, or tathata. Going on to verse 132. Wow. There are no stages of bodhisattva-ship, no truths, no Buddha lands, no bodies of transformation. Buddhas, pratyeka Buddhas, Shravakas are products of imagination. This is profound teaching. This, again, so much, it points to the fact that so much of the teaching within the sutras about bodhisattvahood and the path and the stages and all these things, they're expedient means to get to that point of realizing that just what it said here, there are no stages, no truths, no Buddha lands, no bodies of transformation. That goes beyond the more mundane articulation of an actual path where attainment can be, quote, accomplished. 140. The world is everywhere filled with Buddhas of maturity, Buddhas of transformation, beings, bodhisattvas, and Buddha lands. That's the one that Suzuki quoted earlier. 148. Relative knowledge, or vijnana, takes place where there is something resembling an external world. Transcendental knowledge, or jnana, belongs to the realm of suchness. When a turning back, or parivrita, takes place, there is a state of imagelessness, which is the realm of the wise. 151. When relative knowledge is purified by keeping itself aloof from discrimination and detached from imagination, there is a turning back to the abode of suchness. And then 154. To those who see the world clearly and properly, the separation between that which perceives and that which is perceived ceases. There is no external world as is discriminated by the ignorant. Non-duality. He's talking about non-duality, which is the nature of this non-dual consciousness that represents as much as words can the ultimate reality that Buddhism is pointing to. And the Lankavatara, better than probably any of the other scriptures, talks about the limitations of words and concepts to be able to express such truths. 162. Philosophical doctrines are definite, but the Mahayana, or great vehicle, is not definite. It is set in motion by the thoughts of beings. It is not an abode for those who see wrongly. The vehicle realized within my own inner self is not the realm that can be reached by dialecticians. So they're constantly making a distinction between Buddhism as a religion versus the sort of the concepts propagated by philosophers or dialecticians. And again, set in motion by the thoughts of beings, it brings to mind this idea that there would be no Buddhas if there weren't any beings, because it's the thoughts of beings and the suffering of beings that stimulates the need for Buddhas to help us. 175. Language belongs to the realm of thought. The truth becomes thus wrongly represented. Transcendental knowledge, or prajna, being discriminated by thought, falls into a duality. Therefore, transcendental knowledge is something not imagined. So here we get into the notion of prajna, which is that sixth paramita, that all-important paramita, the perfection of wisdom, which is addressed in so many of the Prajnaparamita sutras. 185. This world is just a sign indicative of reality, or dharmata. Apart from the sign, nothing is produced, nothing is destroyed. So here we have reference to that fundamental notion that all things are unborn. Going to 226. When the citta, manas, vijnana cease to rise, then there is the attainment of the will body and of the Buddha stage. These are terms that you would have to maybe study and understand better. And Suzuki, again, a good reason to get his studies book, because he talks about the citta, the manas, the vijnana, etc., and explains some of those. But going on to 236, the mind, or citta, is not separate from habit energy, nor is it together with it. Though enveloped with habit energy, the mind itself remains undifferentiated. And then in 237, habit energy, born of the manovijnana, is like dirt, wherewith the citta, which is a perfectly white garment, is enveloped and fails to display itself. So we have a whole framework here to understand the defilements that keep us from being enlightened in this life. And then in 243, this most important concept where we say, as long as there is something attained, there is so much error arising. When the mind itself is thoroughly understood, error neither rises nor ceases. Now, when I did the recitation, I really didn't specify in the various places where the word mind comes up that in many, if not most of those places, it's mind with a capital M. And so, again, there's special meaning to the term mind. that you would need to become familiar with if you dig down into this scripture. 258. The state of non-striving is quiescent and thoroughly purified with the original vows. The most excellent knowledge of egolessness sees no duality in the world because of imagelessness. Vows, of course, being critical to the Bodhisattva path. 268. I'm just going to read a segment from 268 and 270. Highest truth is beyond words. The Dharma is seen when cessation takes place. Let me go back and do the whole 268 where he says, the philosophers imagine a permanently existing creator engaged in mere verbalism. Highest truth is beyond words. The Dharma is seen when cessation takes place. And then in 270, what is established by a proposition is a proposition. Suchness is the essence of mind. When this is clearly perceived, the yogin attains the knowledge of mind only. And this whole sort of school is supposedly the mind-only school related to the Yogacara school of Buddhism. 277, we again hit this point that there are no Buddhas, no truths, no fruition, no causal agents, no perversion, no nirvana, no passing away, no birth. Well, that right there could be sort of put on a placard as the ultimate essence, in a sense, of Mahayana Buddhism. 280. By maintaining the mind only, the idea of reality is removed. By establishing the mind only, permanency and annihilation are seen in their proper relationship. And to 281, there are no skandhas in nirvana, nor is there an ego soul, nor any individual signs. By entering into the mind only, one escapes from becoming attached to emancipation. So think of all that we're asked to give up. 312. The elements are devoid of selfhood. There is neither qualified nor qualifying in them. If all element-made objects were the elements, form would be element-made. And in 319, disjoined from causal agencies, removed from faulty theories, is the knowledge of self-realization, which is the Mahayana, immovable and highest. Self-realization of noble wisdom is the key way that they describe in the Lankavatara the experience, that experience of the revulsion or turning away. A couple of more. In 358 it says, when mind only is understood, external objects are abandoned, and discrimination no more takes place. Here the middle path is reached. And of course later we have the whole elaboration of the middle path, which I guess you could say connects back to the historical Buddha and his insight about the middle path between self-indulgence and asceticism. But again, in the Tenchai or Tendai approach, you again have a certain middle path in the sense that there are three truths. So let me just go on here. Let's see. 362. As it is understood that there is nothing but what is seen of the mind, the attachment to duality is destroyed. Knowledge indeed is the abandonment, not the destruction of the discriminated. As it becomes thoroughly known that there is nothing but what is seen of the mind, discrimination ceases. As discrimination ceases, suchness is removed from intellection. Again, always wanting to get away from head stuff and get into what is beyond words and concepts. Well, I'm getting a little bit weary here in terms of my voice, so let's see what we got. 423. Since sentient beings are differentiated as to their mentality and individuality, the Buddhas who have achieved self-mastery over their minds teach the ignorant the 7 stages. So again, skillful means, expedient means. The Buddhas try to orient teachings toward what people can take in, what they can understand. And, we are a creature who I guess we inherently like to think in terms of progress, accomplishment, stages, what we can attain. And, so the Buddha teaches it in those terms until the person is ready to transcend that paradigm. 426. Birth and no birth, emptiness and no emptiness, self-nature and no self-nature. These are not discriminated by the knowing one. In mind only, no such things obtain. 510. I make all beings covet varieties of imagined fruit, whereby I lead them to the truth that goes beyond the antithesis of being and non-being. Again, skillful means. The Lanka doesn't talk explicitly about skillful means, but essentially that's what we're referencing here. 519. Those who are equipped with a noble insight and are thoroughly conversant with the suchness of reality know well how to turn over ideas and reach the other shore of the Vijnana. This is the seal of emancipation belonging to those sons who have embraced my teaching. It is released from existence and non-existence, removed from coming and going. And of course, when he talks about these sons, the whole of the Buddhist literature is laced with gender insensitivity, let's put it that way. Although there are many that talk about good sons and good daughters, and in some of my recitations, I've sort of made modifications to incorporate more gender sensitivity. That was a ring for my phone, but I'm just going to go on for a little bit here. 631. As a bird moves in the air according to its fancy without abiding anywhere, without depending on anything, as if moving on earth, so people with all their discrimination move along, walk about in the mind itself like a bird, moving in the air. And then Suzuki has a footnote saying, this means that in spite of our discriminations and imaginings, we cannot get away from the control of mind only, which is, religiously expressed, Amitabha Buddha pursues sentient beings as is taught in Shin Buddhism, in spite of their struggle to run away from his all-embracing love. Thus interpreted, this verse gives us a new outlook in the philosophy of the Lankavatara.